They called Caleb Voss a madman the morning he planted the weed every farmer in Crowley County had been fighting for 20 years. Not corn, not wheat, not soybeans, he planted silverleaf bindweed on purpose. The county board called it a public threat. His fuel account was frozen, his irrigation lines were cut in the dark. And one night, someone rolled onto his land with chemical tanks and tried to kill every acre before harvest. They thought they had finally ruined him, they had not. They had just turned the most hated weed in western Kansas into the richest crop any of them had ever seen. Caleb was 34 when he came back to the Voss place, and he did not come back with pride. He came back with a cardboard box of office shirts, a broken marriage he refused to talk about, and a phone full of missed calls from lenders. His father, Raymond Voss, had died in March after a heart attack in the machine shed. The funeral was small, wind-bitten, and quiet. Most people in Crowley County came out of respect for Raymond, not for Caleb. Caleb had left for Denver 12 years earlier and told everyone who asked that farming was a slow way to go broke. Now, he was back. And the farm had already gone broke without him. The Voss place covered 520 acres outside Larkin, Kansas. On a map, it still looked like a family operation. In person, it looked abandoned by mercy. The topsoil was thin, the pivot tower on the north quarter leaned like a tired animal. The old Massey Ferguson combine sat under a tarp with mice nesting in the cab, and on the southern half of the property, the ground shimmered white in patches where years of bad irrigation had pulled salt to the surface. At First Plains Bank, Caleb sat across from Margaret Seal, a loan officer who had known him since he was 8. She did not smile when she slid the file across the desk. "Your father was behind longer than he admitted," Margaret said. "The operating note, the equipment balance, property tax. All of it together comes to $738,000. Caleb stared at the number. It looked less like debt than a verdict. "You have until December 1st, she said. "After that, the bank moves on the land." The bank already had a buyer waiting. Reed Latham. Latham owned almost 9,000 acres around Larkin. He ran seed trials, contract wheat, and enough custom spraying crews to make half the county dependent on him. His fields bordered 3 sides of the Voss farm, and for years he had been waiting for Raymond to slip. At the funeral, Reed had shaken Caleb's hand and said, "A man should know when land is done carrying him." Caleb understood the translation. Sell cheap, leave clean. Do not make this difficult. For 5 nights, Caleb slept in his father's recliner, with Raymond's ledgers spread across the living room floor. He searched for crop insurance paperwork, hidden savings, anything Raymond might have kept quiet. On the 6th night, he found the green notebook. It was shoved behind a cracked photograph of Caleb's mother in the kitchen cabinet. Wrapped in butcher paper and tied with baling twine. Inside were 5 years of notes written in Raymond's square, stubborn handwriting. At first, Caleb thought it was madness. Rows of dates, soil salinity readings, root depths, harvest weights, drying temperatures, lab codes, and one name, repeated again and again: Silverleaf bindweed. Every farmer in Crowley County hated that plant. It crawled through wheat, it wrapped itself around young milo. It spread underground through white, rope-thick roots that could survive plows, drought, and most herbicides people could afford. Farmers did not call it silverleaf, they called it widow rope. Because once it got into a field, it tied a man to loss. Raymond had not just been studying it, he had been cultivating it. Caleb nearly threw the notebook into the stove. Then, a folded letter slipped from the back cover. The letterhead read, "Branton Therapeutics, Basel Field Division." Caleb read it 3 times before he believed the words. A specific salt-tolerant mutation of silverleaf bindweed on Raymond Voss's land produced a rare root resin called V17 lignate. Branton could not synthesize it cheaply. Their transplant drug pipeline needed it as a stabilizing compound. They were willing to purchase properly dried root and seed material at $1,450 per processed pound, pending field verification. Below the letter was a contract Raymond had never signed. And in the margin, in pencil, Raymond had written one sentence. "The dirt is not ruined, it is choosing a different crop." Caleb sat very still. Outside, the Kansas wind pressed against the windows. Corn would not save the Voss farm. Wheat would not save it. Soybeans would not save it. The thing everyone else spent money trying to kill might. By the end of April, Caleb had made the decision that turned Crowley County against him. He cashed out his last retirement account, he sold his truck and bought a smaller one with rust in both doors. He bought drying screens, root lifters, fertilizer, and 3 used seed drills nobody else wanted. Then he walked the ditches, creek beds, fence rows, and abandoned corners of the farm, collecting every mature bindweed seed pod he could find. Neighbors watched him from the road. At first, they thought he was clearing weeds, then they saw what he did with them. He planted them. He seeded 410 acres of widow rope into rows as straight as any wheat stand. By the second week of June, the Voss farm turned silver. The bindweed leaves caught the morning light like fish scales, fine vines crept over the beds. White trumpet flowers opened by the thousands. From a distance, the fields looked almost beautiful. Up close, they looked like a threat. Reed Latham saw them first from the cab of a spray rig. That same afternoon, Caleb walked into May's coffee room and the whole place went quiet. Reed was sitting at the counter with 2 seed dealers and a county commissioner. He turned slowly on the stool. "You lose your mind out there, boss." Caleb kept walking toward the register. "Morning, Reed. I asked you a question." Caleb poured coffee into a paper cup and put $2 on the counter. "I planted a crop." Reed laughed once, no one else did. "That is not a crop," Reed said. "That is a quarantine problem with roots. It is on my land. When that pollen moves, when those runners cross the ditch, when one piece of that poison gets into my certified seed wheat, you will not have land anymore, you will have lawsuits." Caleb turned toward him. "My father logged containment trials for 5 years. Root barriers on the north line, mowed perimeter on the east, no seed heads beyond the inner quarter before harvest." Reed stood up. He was a thick man with a sunburned neck, clean boots, and the calm expression of someone used to being obeyed. "Your father is dead," Reed said. "And you are not him." That line reached Caleb harder than he wanted it to, but he did not lower his eyes. "No," Caleb said. "I am the one who signed the contract." By July, the county board called an emergency meeting. The high school gym filled before 6 o'clock. Farmers stood against the walls with folded arms, wives whispered over paper fans. Reed Latham sat in the front row, polished and patient, as if the verdict had already been printed. Caleb sat alone near the back. Commissioner Dean Haskell opened the meeting by calling the Voss farm an active biological nuisance. A crop consultant showed photographs of bindweed damage on wheat. A seed dealer talked about contamination risk. A retired farmer said Raymond Voss would be ashamed to see his son turn their home into a weed factory. Then Reed stepped to the microphone. "This is bigger than one bad farmer making one desperate mistake," he said. "This is one man endangering every clean field in Crowley County. If we let this stand, we tell every operator in this room that private foolishness matters more than public survival." The gym erupted. Someone shouted, "Plow it under." Someone else yelled, "Run him out." Commissioner Haskell banged the table. "Mr. Voss," he said. "The board has given you 72 hours to destroy the crop voluntarily. If you refuse, we will pursue county abatement." Caleb stood. His mouth had gone dry, but Raymond's notebook was under his arm. "County code applies to unmanaged noxious growth," Caleb said. "This is a contracted specialty crop with controlled borders, documented monitoring. And the licensed buyer." Reed smiled without warmth. "You bring a lawyer?" "No." "Then what did you bring?" Caleb held up the notebook. "Records." A few people laughed. Caleb looked at them until the laughter thinned. "My father knew more about this dirt than any man in this room. I ignored him for 12 years. I will not do it twice." That did not win the county over, it only made them angrier. The pressure started the next morning. The co-op delayed his fertilizer delivery until the invoice expired. The parts store refused to order belts for the old combine. Someone cut the fence on the south pasture and let 15 cattle wander into the seed beds. 2 weeks later, Caleb woke up to smoke and found his hay baler burning behind the barn. The sheriff took a report and said there were no witnesses. Reed stopped by the next afternoon. He leaned on Caleb's gate as if it belonged to him already. "Last chance," Reed said. "I will pay enough to clear your personal debt and get you out of here. Not selling. That weed will not make you respectable." Caleb looked past him at the silver fields. "I am not trying to be respectable." Reed's jaw tightened. "Then be careful trying to be clever." By August, the bindweed had done what wheat could not. It thrived. The salt patches that killed Raymond's grain were feeding the root resin. The hotter the afternoons got, the deeper the vines pushed. Caleb sent samples to Branton's field lab every 10 days. The first report came back at 4.8% V-17 density. The second at 6.2. The third at 7.1. Branton's field director, Dr. Elise Marin, scheduled a final verification visit for September 14. If the crop passed, Caleb would receive an advance large enough to stop the bank, repair the equipment, and pay cash for next season. He marked the date on the kitchen calendar. Then he circled it until the paper tore. 14 days, that was all he had to survive. On September 10th, a dry storm rolled over Larkin after midnight. No rain fell. Only wind. Only heat lightning. Only dust moving like smoke over the road. Caleb was asleep on the porch swing when the dog started barking. Then he heard engines, not one, several. He ran to the edge of the yard. Across the west quarter, yellow work lights crawled through the bindweed rows. 3 high-clearance sprayers were moving in a line, their booms stretched wide, misting the field with a pale chemical fog. For 1 second, Caleb could not move. Then his body caught up with what his eyes were seeing. He jumped into the truck and tore down the lane. By the time he reached them, nearly 80 acres had been sprayed. Caleb slammed the truck sideways in front of the lead rig. "Shut it down." The sprayers stopped. The cab door opened. Reed Latham climbed down wearing a respirator around his neck. Behind him stood 2 hired applicators, and Commissioner Haskell's nephew. Caleb's hands were shaking. "You are on my land." Reed looked out over the silver rows vanishing under chemical burn. "No, Caleb. I am standing between this county and your mistake. You just destroyed a contracted crop. I destroyed a public hazard." Caleb stepped toward him. One of the applicators pushed him back. Reed pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket and held it up. "Emergency complaint filed with the county. If you want to argue, argue after the seed heads are gone. That paper does not give you the right to spray." Reed leaned close. "No. But by the time anyone cares, your crop will be dead." Then he nodded. One of the men shoved Caleb, hard enough to drop him to one knee. Another grabbed his phone and threw it into the field. The sprayers reversed, turned, and left the way they had come, lights fading into the dust. Caleb stayed in the road until the engines disappeared. The first vines were already curling. Silver leaves folded inward, white flowers browned at the rim. The field smelled, sharp, metallic, wrong. Caleb found his phone in the dirt with a cracked screen and called the sheriff. No answer. Then he called Dr. Marin. When she picked up, he could barely get the words out. They sprayed it, he said. The west quarter, maybe more. Reed Latham hit it with something after midnight. There was silence on the line. Tell me exactly what it looks like. Leaves curling. Flowers dying. Stems going gray. Do not plow it. Caleb closed his eyes. Elise, it is dead. Her voice changed. Do not plow it. I am leaving now. At sunrise, the Voss farm looked ruined. The silver fields had turned ash gray. The flowers hung limp. The vines lay collapsed across the rows, as if the whole farm had exhaled and stopped breathing. Caleb stood at the field edge, with dust in his hair and a bruise swelling under his ribs. Dr. Elise Marin arrived at 7:40 in a white rental SUV with lab cases stacked in the back. She did not waste time comforting him. She put on gloves, cut several sprayed vines, pulled root samples from 2 rows, and laid them across a portable analyzer on the tailgate. Caleb watched the screen without understanding any of it. 10 minutes passed. Then Marin stopped moving. She stared at the readout. Caleb felt the last of his hope go cold. How bad? Marin did not answer. She ran the sample again, then a third time. Finally she looked up. What did they spray? I do not know. Herbicide, defoliant, something hot. No, she said, not just herbicide. She turned the analyzer so he could see the rising bars. The plant is dumping resin into the root crown. Caleb blinked. What does that mean? It means your father was right about the stress response, but he never pushed it this far. She spoke quickly now, almost to herself. In normal growth, V17 accumulates gradually in the outer root tissue. But under terminal chemical stress, the plant stops defending the leaves. It drives everything it has into the crown and seed node to preserve reproduction. It is not dying quietly. It is concentrating. Caleb looked across the gray field. So, it can still be harvested. Marin took a breath. Caleb, the unsprayed samples were testing at 7%. These are testing at 39.6. The wind moved over the dead vines. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb said, what is it worth? At this density, Marin swallowed. Our contract price changes. We are not buying raw wheat anymore. We are buying high-grade pharmaceutical feedstock. Branton can authorize $6,200 per processed pound. Caleb grabbed the truck door to steady himself. But there is a problem, Marin said. Of course there was. The root crowns are drying too fast. Once they crack, the resin oxidizes. You have 40 hours, maybe less. After that, this field really is worthless. Caleb laughed once, but there was no humor in it. 400 acres in 40 hours. Can you harvest that? Caleb looked toward the machine shed. The old root lifter was older than he was. The combine barely started. Half the county hated him. Not alone. At 8:12, Caleb called Rosa Pimentel. Rosa ran a custom beat crew 2 counties south, with her brothers, her cousins, and a reputation for working through conditions that made other operators park their machines. Reed Latham had undercut her on a contract 3 years earlier and nearly put her out of business. She answered on the 4th ring. Voss, I heard Latham burned you down. He tried. Then why are you calling? I need diggers. Lifters. Trucks, people who can work until they hate me. That costs money you do not have. It will cost more if I fail. Rosa was quiet. Caleb said, Rosa, I can pay 200,000 if we finish before the resin cracks. I will put it in writing with Branton's attorney on the phone. Another silence. Then Rosa said, send the pin. By noon, the road to the Voss farm looked like a military convoy. 6 beat lifters. 4 dump trucks. 2 service pickups. A portable dryer. And 23 people who did not care what Crowley County thought. They moved fast. The lifters tore through the gray rows, shaking root crowns out of the ground in thick ropes. Crews cut, sorted, loaded, and hauled them to the dryers. Marin tested every batch. Caleb drove until his hands cramped around the steering wheel. They worked through heat. They worked through dust. They worked through darkness. At 2 a.m., one lifter blew a hydraulic line. Rosa's youngest brother patched it under floodlights while Caleb held the hose with both hands and oil ran down his sleeves. At sunrise, half the west quarter was done. At noon, the first dryer batch came back stable. Marin raised both hands over her head. Green, she shouted. The crew cheered like they had won a game. Across the road, Reed Latham parked his pickup by the ditch and watched. He thought Caleb was harvesting dead weeds out of spite. He took a video and posted it to the county growers page. Caption: Voss finally found a market for trash. By evening, every machine on Caleb's land was coated in gray dust. The men and women on the crew looked like ghosts. Rosa's voice was nearly gone from shouting directions. Caleb had stopped feeling his bruises. At 11:38 p.m., the final truck rolled onto the scale. Marin ran the last batch. The analyzer flashed green. Caleb sat down in the dirt. He did not pray, he did not cheer, he only put both hands over his face and breathed like a man who had been underwater for 12 years. On December 1st, Margaret Seal came to First Plains Bank early. Foreclosures were always worse when she knew the family. The Voss file sat on her desk beside the deed transfer forms. Reed Latham had already submitted a sealed purchase offer. It was low enough to be insulting but high enough for the bank to accept. Once the land cleared, at 9:05, the front door opened. Caleb Voss walked in, wearing a dark jacket, clean boots, and a face Margaret had never seen on him before. Behind him walked Dr. Elise Marin and a Branton attorney carrying a leather folder. Margaret stood. Caleb. He sat across from her and placed a cashier's check on the desk. She looked down. Then she looked again. $738,000, exact payoff. Where did this come from? The attorney opened the folder. Sale proceeds from a contracted agricultural pharmaceutical harvest. Funds verified. Taxes withheld. No lien conflict. Margaret's fingers rested on the check. The county said your crop failed. Caleb leaned back. The county was wrong. She stamped the foreclosure file satisfied. Caleb did not smile until she handed him the release. Your father would have liked this, she said quietly. Caleb looked at the paper. No, he said. He would have said I was late. While Caleb was clearing the debt, Reed Latham was discovering the price of his own arrogance. The chemical he had used was not part of any licensed application plan. He had bought it through a private distributor after midnight, mixed it too strong, and sprayed during a temperature inversion. When the sun rose after the sabotage, the vapor did not stay on Caleb's field. It lifted. It crossed the road. And it settled over 1,700 acres of Reed specialty seed wheat. At first, the damage looked minor. A little twist in the leaves. A little yellowing along the veins. Then the heads emerged sterile. By harvest, whole sections stood tall and empty. Insurance denied the claim after residue testing. The seed company canceled Reed's contract. The state opened an investigation into unlicensed chemical application and drift damage. Farmers who once depended on Reed's spraying crews began calling lawyers of their own. The man who had accused Caleb of threatening the county had poisoned his own income stream. 6 months later, the courthouse steps were crowded for the Latham equipment auction. Not the whole empire, not yet, but enough. Sprayers, service trucks, a grain cart. 2 tractors Reed had once parked beside Caleb's fence just to make a point. Caleb stood at the back with Rosa Pimentel and watched the bidding start. The old bitterness was still in the crowd, but it had changed shape. People no longer looked at Caleb like a fool, they looked at him like a storm they had misread. The final settlement from Branton was larger than Caleb had been able to imagine when he found Raymond's notebook. The emergency harvest produced 3,860 processed pounds of high-density root resin. At $6,200 per pound, the first sale brought in just under $24 million. Branton then signed a 12-year exclusivity agreement for the Voss saltground cultivation protocol, with milestone payments tied to future planting cycles. Caleb paid Rosa first. Then he paid the bank. Then he bought back Raymond's machinery from the edge of scrap and hired 3 operators who had refused to work for Reed after the investigation opened. When the auctioneer called for bids on Reed's lead sprayer, the machine that had rolled through Caleb's field that night, no one spoke at first. Caleb raised his hand. 100,000. The crowd went silent. The auctioneer waited. No counterbid came. The gavel fell. Caleb bought the machine that was supposed to end him. But he did not use it for chemicals, he stripped the tank, rebuilt the frame, and turned it into a mobile root washer for the next bindweed crop. That spring, Caleb stood beside the south quarter at sunrise. The soil still carried salt. The wind still carried dust. The county still carried rumors. But the rows were ready. Rosa's crew had built root barriers along the ditch. Marin's team had installed monitoring stations, and in the shed, Raymond's green notebook sat in a steel box, no longer hidden behind a photograph. Caleb knelt at the edge of the first bed and pressed a silver seed into the ground. For most of Crowley County, it was still widow rope, a weed, a threat, a thing to poison before it spread. For Caleb, it was the crop his father had seen before anyone else was willing to look. The land had never been worthless. Everyone had simply been trying to kill the part of it that knew how to survive.